Anora is a mix of a tragedy love story and a farcical comedy, following Anora, who is a stripper and sex worker as she gets entangled with the son of a Russian billionaire. The story of Anora follows three distinct acts with three distinct feelings and vibes. First being the fantasy of Anora and Ivan's relationship and marriage. The second act being the farce of Ivan's handlers figuring out what has occurred and attempting to undo what Anora and Ivan have now done. Finally, the third act, where Ivan's parents get involved and there's a snap back to reality for all the characters, but specifically for Anora. As the story unravels, we see how love, fantasy, power, and decorum change depending on the circumstances. Before we get too far into the review and analysis, it would be great if you would like the video and subscribe to the channel. It goes a long way to helping make more of these videos. Thank you. The first act of the film is the traditional fantasy of sex workers. This is the act of the film with the most razzle-dazzle, with the sultry shots of strippers, but also the energy of the environment is intoxicating. Anything could be happening behind those doors that happen in the strip club. We are introduced to Anora, an honest working girl who works the room and puts in the effort to earn what she makes. Actually, I think the film does a great job of showing that being a stripper is not a super easy job that everyone maybe thinks it is. It actually seems like a lot of work, a lot of effort. You actually have to seem to care about what your clients care about, and you have to try and engage with them and try and, work the room, as they say. But it does seem like she's earning her living. It's definitely not just an easy walk in the park. We are then soon introduced to Ivan, a high roller who's looking for a girl who speaks Russian, looking for the girlfriend experience, or the fantasy of it. This is a game Anora knows well, and during this portion of the film, she's in total control. This is the honeymoon phase of Anora and Ivan's relationship. But by the end of the first act, the script gets flipped. Ivan offers Anora a fantasy of her own, the fantasy of becoming the wife of a Russian billionaire's son. This symbolizes an escape from Anora's current life and no longer having to hustle for a living, which obviously is enticing to her, and she pounces on it, even though I think even on the onset she knows how unrealistic that is. Almost as soon as their marriage is cemented, the gears of the outside world begin to undo their fantasy. Ivan's handlers learn of the marriage, and the farce of trying to annul the marriage begins. This section of the film is really funny, but also at the beginning, for me, it was a little scary. I mean, it was silly with Igor, one of the family's henchmen, attempting to capture Anora and ending up in a compromised position with her while trying to tie her up. I was also genuinely worried for Anora. Was going to get murdered or unpersoned or something like that. And the film was going to take a very dark Russian mobster route. I thought that was a possibility, which I think shows how up in the air the situation is. And I think that was a good way of presenting it. Fortunately, we don't go down that route, and it becomes sort of a silly, funny, trying to find Ivan situation where everyone's acting like an idiot because no one knows really what to do in this situation, basically. And I would say that this section is sort of intentionally strangely paced, and it could have probably been a little bit shorter, but it was still a fun sequence. After many hijinks, Ivan's parents come to New York. Ivan's mother completely dashes all of Anora's hopes of staying married, and I think that this is sort of obviously a commentary on class. There was never going to be a world where Ivan was going to marry Anora. But we have conventions in today's world where the two could fall in love, they could have sex, and the rich get to orchestrate this whole fantasy for Ivan with no consequences, which I think is obviously an inherently unjust thing, but that's the world we live in. And I think a similar commentary is made by Slavoj Zizek about the movie Titanic. It's the concept that the rich use the poor as sort of an emotional life force that they consume until they get bored with it and then discard them, basically making them consumable and disposable people. And obviously this paints the rich as sort of being figurative vampires. And I mean, it is true that Ivan completely did lack the maturity of such a commitment, but he still got to have his cake and eat it too, in the sense that he got to have the joy and drama of it all with none of the consequences. Once again, telling us that the rich don't have the same level of consequences as the poor do. With her marriage annulled, Anora and Igor head back to New York. Anora and Igor have a conversation that comes to a head when Anora calls Igor an F word for not wanting to rape her. This sort of shows Anora's twisted concept of men, that only strong and quality men would have raped her, basically. And the fact that Igor showed restraint and didn't want to do that, he's obviously a lesser man in her eyes. Sort of opening up the door for us into understanding how Anora sees men and how her relationship with men are, how she thinks it's supposed to go, basically, and how kind of unhealthy of a relationship she has with men is. When Igor drops Anora off at home, he gives her a small kindness by returning the wedding ring that was taken from her. Anora, wanting to show a kindness back to Igor, begins to have sex with him. This is another sign that Anora only sees her value as being what she can offer sexually. Obviously, this whole farce sort of began as that, as it is sort of this experience of her selling her sexuality and then thinking that it's more than that, and then it turns out that no, it's not that at all, and she got in way over her head and believed in the fantasy that she kind of helped create. And it's sort of almost pathological for her. When Igor attempts to show her affection back, she rejects him, and eventually breaks down and cries. Another sign that Anora doesn't believe she is really deserving of love, or that her physical needs need to be addressed in sort of the love-making process. It was supposed to purely be for Igor's enjoyment, because that's how she's been trained or felt like how she has to act with men, basically. And I feel like Anora's breakdown is her emotional epiphany of what she has done to herself and how little she values herself when it comes to selling her sexuality and her love. Anora is a fun but incredibly emotionally complicated ride. The story genuinely made me hope that Anora, after these events, would begin to see herself in a higher regard and that she deserves love and doesn't have to sell her sexuality. I was also really impressed with the character of Igor. I thought Igor was just a dumb thug at the beginning, but by the end, his acknowledgement of the human condition by telling Anora that Ivan's family was miserable even though they were rich was very enlightening. And I think with all these complicated characters, the very interesting situation and plot, for me this film is, even though I wouldn't say it does anything amazing technically, is a B+ for me. Because this was an amazing movie in my opinion, while not technically pushing the medium in any sort of form. The emotions of the story and the depth of the characters is something that you don't find very often. So I highly recommend you go see Anora. Thanks for listening to my review and analysis of Anora. It would mean a lot if you would like the video and subscribe to the channel, and if you wouldn't mind supporting me on Patreon, it goes a long way to helping me make more of these videos. Thank you.